The camera caught it before the audience did. Dean Martin's hand, resting on the arm of that Tonight Show guest chair, went completely still the moment Frank Sinatra said his name. That stillness cost him something. It had been costing him something for 10 years. Wait, because what happened in the next 4 minutes of live television would be the only time in 30 years that either man came within arm's reach of the truth, and neither of them had planned it. And Johnny Carson spent the rest of his career telling people he had no idea it was coming. It was 1976. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, NBC Burbank Studio 1, a Tuesday night in late October, with a live audience of 300 people who had waited in line since noon and had no idea what they were about to see. Frank Sinatra was booked. Dean Martin had been booked separately for the second guest slot, in the way that the show's producers sometimes stacked big names without thinking too carefully about what putting them in the same room might produce. The booking had seemed like a coup. 2 legends, 1 couch, Johnny Carson between them. Great television on paper. Nobody had done the math on what 10 years of managed silence looks like when it walks into a room and sits down 6 inches from the reason for the silence. And nobody, not the producers, not Carson, not the 300 people who had waited in line since noon, knew what question Dean Martin had been carrying since June of 1966 that he had never once asked out loud. Notice the set. The Tonight Show in 1976 was all earth tones and walnut paneling, a room designed to make everyone look comfortable, to sand down edges, to create the specific illusion that powerful people were just having a casual conversation in someone's living room. The guest chairs were upholstered in olive green. The desk was wide and brown and solid, a piece of furniture that communicated authority without aggression. The studio smelled of warm stage lighting and the faint trace of cigarette smoke that had worked its way into the upholstery over years of late-night tapings. A smell that said this room had heard 1,000 conversations and would hear 1,000 more. Carson sat behind it in his brown wide lapel suit and did what he did better than anyone alive. He made the room feel safe. That was his gift. That was also, on this particular Tuesday, his problem. Dean came out first, the way the second guest always does, after Frank had been seated, after the first commercial break, after the applause had settled into something warmer and more familiar. He walked out in a tan blazer and an open-collar cream shirt, no tie, looking the way Dean Martin always looked, which is to say he looked like the most relaxed man who had ever lived. The audience loved it. They always loved it. The ease was real, which is the thing people who studied Dean Martin from a distance never fully understood. The ease was not a performance. It was a genuine condition of his nervous system, a factory setting that no amount of accumulated weight had ever succeeded in dislodging. He sat down. He and Frank did not embrace. They shook hands, briefly, in the way that men shake hands when the handshake is standing in for something too complicated to say out loud. Carson said something about what a treat it was. The audience applauded. Frank smiled. Dean smiled. The machine of professional courtesy ran without friction, the way it had been running for 10 years. Then Carson, who was good at his job in the way that surgeons are good at their jobs, which is to say, technically flawless, and occasionally catastrophic in the wrong conditions, asked Frank about the old days. Look at what that question does. In a room where both men are sitting, the old days. The Rat Pack, the Copa, the Sands, the records, the movies, the television specials, the years when the 3 of them, Frank, Dean, Sammy, had been the gravitational center of American entertainment. Carson asked it warmly, the way journalists ask about the past when they want to generate nostalgia and keep the conversation light. It was the correct question for a different night. On this particular Tuesday, it opened a door that neither man had agreed to open. Frank talked for 2 minutes about the Sands, about the Copper Room shows in 1960, about the way the 3 of them would be on until 2 in the morning, and then stay up until 6. He was good at this. Frank Sinatra was always good at this. The warm mythologizing of shared history, the particular gift of making other people feel like they had been there. The audience leaned forward. Carson nodded. Dean sat with one arm draped over the chair back and a slight smile on his face, the smile of a man listening to a story he knows very well and has decided to let pass without comment. But Frank didn't stop at 1960. Stop for a second and picture the room from the camera angle, because the geometry matters. Frank is to Carson's left. Dean is to Carson's right. Carson is the physical gap between them. The desk, the space, the professional buffer. What the camera is catching, if you know what to look for, is the two different versions of the same history, sitting 3 feet apart and being asked to present a unified account of it. Frank talked about 1966. He didn't say June. He didn't say Beverly Hills. He said 1966 in the vague, general way that someone says a year when they're gesturing at a period rather than a specific event. He said something about how things had gotten complicated, about how the pressures of that era had put strains on friendships that nobody talked about publicly. He said it the way Frank Sinatra said difficult things, which is in the key of regret, with a tone that implied accountability without specifying what the account was. Dean's hand went still on the armrest. The audience didn't catch it. Carson caught it. You can see him catch it on the recording if you know what you're looking at. A microsecond of recalibration behind his eyes, the professional instinct that tells you something is shifting in the room. But he didn't intervene. He let Frank continue. There were nights, Frank said, where I didn't handle things the way I should have. He wasn't looking at Carson when he said it. He was looking at the desk, at his own hands on the desk. Dean was looking at Frank. Now listen carefully, because what happened next is the part that nobody who was in that studio that night ever described exactly the same way twice, which is itself a kind of testimony to how strange it was. Dean said, "Which nights, Frank?" 2 words. Quiet. Completely level. No anger in them, no challenge in the conventional sense. The tone was almost academic, the tone of a man asking a clarifying question in a meeting. But in that room, on that Tuesday, with that history, those 2 words were the equivalent of a door swinging open that had been bolted from the inside for 10 years. The audience felt it without understanding it. Carson felt it and understood it completely, and had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Frank looked up from the desk. The 2 men looked at each other across the distance of Johnny Carson's desk and the distance of 10 years, and the distance of everything that had accumulated in the space between a June night in 1966 and this Tuesday in October 1976. And for 3 seconds, the camera caught all 3 of them. Nobody said anything. Hold that silence. 3 seconds of live television silence in 1976 is an eternity. Carson's people in the booth were ready to cut to commercial. The floor director had his hand up. 300 people in the studio audience were not breathing. Frank said, "You know which nights?" And Dean said, "Yeah." And that was it. That was the entire conversation. 2 sentences, crossing a decade of silence, in front of 300 people, and a live camera, and a professional host, who was sitting between them, with his hands very carefully flat on his desk, absolutely not moving. The audience laughed, nervously, uncertainly, the way audiences laugh when they sense they've witnessed something real and don't have a category for it. Carson made a joke, a good one. The timing was perfect. The laugh became a real laugh, and the moment passed, and the show continued, and neither man referenced it again for the remaining 18 minutes of the broadcast. After the taping, Carson's producer told the network it had been a great show, good chemistry, good television. He wasn't wrong. He was also missing the point entirely. 300 people in that studio had just watched something happen between 2 men, and none of them had the context to understand what they had seen. Remember what you just heard, because the thing to understand about those two sentences, you know which nights, and yeah, is what they were doing underneath the words. Frank was not apologizing. Dean was not forgiving. What they were doing was something more specific and more limited, and in its own way, more honest than either of those things. They were acknowledging that the thing existed, that it had happened, that both of them knew it had happened, and had been carrying the weight of knowing, separately, for 10 years, and that the weight was real, even if neither of them was going to put it down publicly on a Tuesday night, on The Tonight Show, with 300 people watching. This is what pass for reckoning between men of a certain generation and a certain code. Not confession, not resolution, just the brief, mutual dropping of the performance that said there was nothing to confess. Dean Martin had spent 10 years giving Frank Sinatra's failures the most generous possible framing. 3 words to his daughter: Frank lost his temper. One sentence designed to close every conversation before it opened. He had done this across 100 rooms and 1,000 questions, and every interview that brushed against 1966. And he had done it without ever once letting the resentment show through the surface, because the surface was the whole point. The surface was what he was protecting. Look at what it cost to build that surface. Dean had been on stage in Lake Tahoe, 6 days after the Polo Lounge, with a black eye and a blood-stained memory, and no one in the audience knowing any of it. He had performed his Tahoe shows with the same lazy, unshakable ease that his audiences paid to see, and then he had gone back to his hotel room by midnight and watched television alone and been grateful for the quiet. He had done this because Dean Martin believed, genuinely, structurally believed, that the audience's experience of the performance was a sacred obligation that had nothing to do with what the performer was carrying. You gave them what they came for. You always gave them what they came for. What you were carrying was your problem, not theirs. But something was different about 1976. The road manager, who had been with Dean since the early 60s, noticed it in the weeks before the Carson taping. Dean was quieter than usual, not the midnight quiet of a man who preferred his own company. The quieter than that. The quiet of a man doing some kind of internal accounting that had been deferred for too long. By 1976, Dean had been keeping Frank's secret for 10 years. He had also been keeping his own, the secret of what it had cost him, what he had absorbed, what the careful management of that particular silence had taken from him in terms of the small daily tax of choosing, again and again, the story that protected Frank over the story that was true. He had been very good at it. He had also been, without ever naming it as such, tired of it. 2 words. Which nights? Frank. The first time in 10 years Dean had asked Frank to be specific about anything. Notice the shape of that moment. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question. And the question was, are you actually going to say it? Are you going to use the words? Or are we going to sit here in front of 300 people and a live camera and do the same thing we've been doing in private for 10 years, which is gesture at the thing without ever naming it? Frank's answer, "You know which nights," was itself a kind of answer to the question. It said, I know you know, I know we both know. It said, this is as far as I can go with this. In this room on this night, in front of these people. It said, I'm sorry, in the only language I have available to me right now, which is not the word sorry, but the acknowledgement that there is something to be sorry for. And Dean's yea was not forgiveness. It was receipt, acknowledgement that the communication had landed, confirmation that the thing had been said in whatever form it could be said, and that he had heard it. It was not enough. It was also given everything, something, and 300 people in a Burbank studio had witnessed it without knowing what they were witnessing, which is its own kind of testament to how well both men had learned to hide the weight. The show went on. They talked about Vegas, Carson asked about their upcoming schedules. Frank mentioned a Caesar's Palace engagement. Dean mentioned a record he was working on. The audience was warm and attentive, and had mostly forgotten the strange 30 seconds in the middle. The floor director brought his hand down. The booth exhaled. The machine of live television continued its smooth and relentless forward motion. But in the green room, after the taping, one of Carson's producers found Dean standing by the window with a glass of something that wasn't water, looking at the parking lot. She asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. He said it in the tone that meant he was not going to discuss it further. She didn't push. What she remembered, years later, when people asked her about that night, was not what he said. It was what she saw on his face, in the 4 seconds before he turned around and assembled the performance back into place. She said it was the face of a man who had just put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time, and wasn't sure yet whether he felt better or worse for having put it down. That's the thing about decade-old weight. You carry it long enough, it stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like structure. You put it down and suddenly you don't know what's holding you up. The 7 years of near silence that followed 1976 are sometimes attributed to the Together Again tour disaster in 1988, when Dean walked away after 6 shows, and Frank said the right things to the press, and the friendship went into a kind of cold storage that looked, from the outside, like a professional disagreement, but was, from the inside, something with deeper roots. The Carson moment is rarely mentioned. It sits in the historical record mostly as a footnote, a briefly strange interlude in an otherwise warm appearance, notable mainly for its brevity. But look at the sequence. The Carson taping was October 1976. Dean's Gold Diggers comment, "I'm keeping away from him too," was 1977. 1 year. 1 year between the moment Frank said, "You know which nights," and the moment Dean told his backup singers to make their own excuses to avoid Frank's after-show gatherings. This is not a coincidence. This is what happens when the performance of carrying something gives way to the actual weight of it. The Carson moment didn't resolve anything. It clarified it. It confirmed in front of 300 people and a camera that both men knew exactly what had happened and exactly what it had cost, and that the acknowledgement of knowing was the most that was ever going to be offered. And once you've confirmed that, once the confirmation is on tape, once it's been seen by an audience, once there's no longer any ambiguity about whether the other person understands, the maintenance of the old performance becomes something different. It becomes a choice. A deliberate, daily choice. And choices you make deliberately are harder to sustain than habits you maintain unconsciously. Dean started making different choices. Wait, because this is the part of the story that gets misread as bitterness. It wasn't. It was something more precise than bitterness, and colder, and ultimately more honest. Not dramatic choices, not confrontational ones. He didn't call Frank and have the conversation. He didn't go to the press. He didn't write a memoir. He made the quiet, incremental choices of a man who has decided, without announcement, that he is done subsidizing someone else's version of events. He went home earlier from after-show gatherings. He was less available. He found the polite, firm language of a man who is withdrawing his presence without making the withdrawal into an event. Frank noticed. Of course, Frank noticed. Frank Sinatra noticed everything. And what he did with what he noticed was process it in the way he processed most things that were uncomfortable, by accelerating into more presence, more events, more of the orbit that Dean was quietly exiting. The firecrackers in the hotel corridors, the demands that everyone stay up, the specific social gravity of Frank Sinatra insisting that the world arrange itself around him, which had always been the most exhausting thing about loving Frank Sinatra, and which after 1976, Dean no longer had the appetite to accommodate. Listen, because here is where the story of one Tuesday night in October becomes the story of everything that followed it. The Together Again tour in 1988 was Frank's idea. Frank proposed it after Dean Paul Martin died. Dean's son, 35 years old, his Air National Guard jet in the San Gabriel Mountains, the wreckage found buried in snow at 11,000 feet. Frank came when Dino died, because that was also who Frank Sinatra was. They sat together. They were in the wreckage of the worst thing, still two men who had known each other for 30 years and understood what that meant. Frank proposed the tour because Frank always proposed the thing that kept people in motion, and motion was Frank's answer to grief. Dean stood at the December press conference and said the right things. He lasted 6 shows. The arenas held 20,000 people. Dean had spent 30 years in intimate Vegas showrooms where the room stayed small enough to hold. The arenas swallowed him. And Frank was Frank. Firecrackers in the corridors. 2 in the morning. Everyone in the orbit. Everything turned up past the level Dean could absorb anymore. He was 60 years old, and grieving, and genuinely no longer able to pretend that the performance of surviving Frank Sinatra's friendship was sustainable. He left. Liza Minnelli replaced him. Frank said the right things to the press. They barely spoke for the better part of 7 years. Not a dramatic rupture, not a scene, just the steady, inevitable conclusion of the arithmetic that had been running since October 1976, when Dean Martin asked 2 words that opened 10 years of silence and got, in return, the confirmation that the silence had been mutual and the weight had been shared and the acknowledgement was the most that would ever be offered. The reconciliation, when it came, was a dinner. 2 old men, a bread roll thrown across the table, the other throwing one back. They laughed. That was apparently sufficient. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, 78 years old. Frank Sinatra said, "Dean was my brother, not by blood, but by choice." If you know the Carson tape, if you've seen Dean's hand go still on the armrest, if you've watched the 3 seconds of silence while the floor director held his hand up and the booth held its breath, that sentence lands differently. Brotherhood is not the absence of weight. Brotherhood is the specific decision to keep carrying it together, even when together means 6 inches apart, on an olive green couch in Burbank, California, on a Tuesday night in October, with 300 people watching, and neither man willing to say, out loud, the thing that both of them have known for 10 years. Which nights, Frank? You know which nights. Yeah, that's the whole conversation. That's also the whole friendship compressed into 7 words and 3 seconds of live television silence that the audience laughed off and Carson cut away from and history filed under footnotes. The people who were actually in that room that night knew they had seen something. They just didn't have the language for what it was, which is what happens when 2 men who have spent 30 years being professionals at the thing called Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, briefly stop performing and look at each other directly. Notice what that costs. Notice what it takes to build a surface that good, maintain it that long, and then sit 6 inches from the reason you built it and ask 2 words without raising your voice. And notice, this is the part that stays with you, that Dean Martin asked the question, not Frank. Dean, the man who had been protecting Frank's version of events for 10 years, was the one who asked Frank to be specific, which means the performance of protection had ended, at least in private, before the Carson taping. Dean had already decided, somewhere in the months before that October Tuesday, that he was done being the only one doing the work of silence. He just chose a Tuesday night in Burbank to let Frank know. If you want to know what Frank said to Dean in the green room, after the cameras stopped, if you want to know whether either of them ever used the actual words, leave it in the comments. Some conversations happen off camera for a reason. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think.